Good morning, good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are and whatever you're doing. I hope you're having a fantastic day. In this video, I'm going to share with you every arcane weapon you should get in preparation for the DLC. There are 11 weapons from 11 different categories, covering pretty much every possible build. So at least one or two of these weapons should fit your playstyle perfectly. This list even includes arcane weapons for ranged users and for spellcasters. So you've got a full arsenal at your disposal and you should be fully prepared for whatever the lands between should hold for us next. Before I get into the main list, let me quickly address another weapon that won't be featuring in the main list, and a lot of people do still believe is the best arcane weapon, and that is the Scavenger's Curved Sword. I'll be as quick as I can, but there's three main reasons this sword isn't on this list. Firstly, it's not inherently arcane. You have to apply an affinity to it to make it arcane, and that applies to any other weapon in the game that isn't inherently arcane. It's not on this list because it's not a true arcane weapon. Secondly, after the insane nerfs to Bleed, yes, it's still powerful. As you can see here, it can still melt bosses, but there are better options, trust me. Don't believe people if they still think this is the best one. And finally, for this build to fully work, you need two of them, which means unless you're willing to get someone to drop this for you, you have to already have done New Game Plus to be able to pull this off. So let's jump into the first actual weapon on this list and start off with the Reduvia. Please note all of the footage you'll be seeing in today's video is on New Game Plus 2, so even though you'll see my stats are very inflated and these weapons are doing crazy amounts of damage, that doesn't mean that this is only viable for endgame builds. I'm on New Game Plus 2, all enemies pack a punch and have insane amounts of health, so you can scale down all the numbers you're seeing if you're still on base New Game. All of these weapons are still going to be crazy powerful and very viable. The Reduvia is the earliest arcane weapon you can get, and this is dropped by defeating Bloody Finger Nereus with the help of Yura in Limgrave. This weapon cannot be infused with other ashes of war, nor can it be coated with oils or anything like that, and that applies to almost every single other weapon on this list as well. I'll come back to almost later when we review two weapons in particular. Now, this weapon is so insanely powerful because of its skill, the Bloodblade. This produces a small wave of blood, which is then flung towards the enemy, and this can be spammed again and again until you run out of stamina or FP, whichever comes first. The blood loss inflicted by the Reduvia Bloodblade is far greater than the weapon's melee strikes, so you basically just want to spam this weapon skill if you are using this weapon. And finally, again, as with any weapon on this list that inflicts blood, which is quite a few of them, the arcane scaling of this weapon affects the amount of blood loss buildup the weapon has. So the higher your arcane stat, the better. You are going to do more damage and inflict blood loss at a crazy high rate. Overall, this is an absolutely incredible early game arcane weapon, and it has fairly low stat requirements to support an early game build. Now we'll move on to a straight sword, the Regalia. And no, I'm not going to pronounce the full name because I always butcher it, so the Regalia it is. This is one of two obtainable weapons in the game that use the Dancing Blade skill. You can actually get this sword as early on in the game as you can the Reduvia by abusing some fairly precise jumps on the cliffs just to the east of the Third Church of Marika. I've showcased this glitch in many videos before, so I won't bore you with it yet again here. I will actually compare this with the Moray Executioner's sword, which is coming up next, and show you the stats of both of them side by side, because at +9 they are pretty much identical. But because the Moray Executioner's sword is a great sword, it attacks far slower, so DPS, the Regalia, is actually slightly more powerful when using standard light attacks. However, the Moray Executioner's sword will outdamage it when using the weapon skill. So both of them are really solid, and as you can see, the damage and the stats is nearly identical. If you do love this skill and want to use either of these swords, the only difference I would say is if you're going for a dexterity arcane build, use the Regalia. If you're going for a strength arcane build, use the Executioner's sword. And talking of the weapon skill, it is absolutely amazing for so many reasons. It will scale with the likes of the Winged Sword Insignia Talisman and the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, because these talismans boost the damage of each consecutive strike, and every single hit of the corkscrew attack is considered a consecutive strike. All things considered though, even when you do include the talismans and the power of the weapon skill, especially on the Moray Greatsword, the overall damage output of these swords is quite lackluster in comparison to a few of the late game arcane weapons that we'll come to in a minute. so they may not be your first choice, at least for a super late game build. So now let's move on to the next one, the Bloody Helice. This is a heavy thrusting sword with one of my favourite weapon skills in the game, purely because it can make you look and feel so cool. Just pay attention to this boss fight with Adan and see how I am able to perfectly dodge his attacks and follow up with an amazing counter. This sword feels so cool to use, and if you get good at using this and are very comfortable with it, it's a really solid PvP weapon because it's not a weapon skill too many people are that familiar with, and it will catch a lot of opponents off guard. I should mention as well, this one is found in the Writhe-Blood ruins in the chest underground after defeating the boss. And finally, this is another one that scales best with a combination of dexterity and arcane. As are most weapons on this list, it definitely feels like arcane builds cater much better to dex than they do to strength. And talking of dexterity-heavy arcane weapons, we're about to move on to the most stat-heavy arcane weapon on this list, and that is Morgott's Cursed Sword. After first acquiring and using this sword, it was my favourite for a while. Its weapon skill, the Cursed Blood Slice, is awesome, and it actually took me a few hours of in-game playtime to realise that it had a follow-up slice if you pressed the skill button a second time. And what is so powerful about the Cursed Blood Slice, on top of the fact that you can attack twice, is the fact that that initial slice will hit and stagger enemies before the bloody trail left then explodes into a burst of flame. So you have essentially got 4 attacks for the price of 1 there, keeping most enemies stun-locked for a significant amount of time and dealing crazy amounts of damage. Once again, as with most weapons on this list, you cannot enchant this or buff it with consumables in any way, nor can the Ash of War be changed, not that you'd want to, because it's one of the best in the game. And again, as with many arcane weapons, the sword's attacks do cause blood loss build-up. And that blood loss build-up is also applied by the Cursed Blood Slice, just in case you were wondering. And it's fairly obvious from the name, though I should have mentioned, you purchase this from Finger Reader Enya by trading in the Remembrance of the Omen King once you have defeated Morgott. Now, let's move on to the next one, the Rivers of Blood. Definitely one of the most powerful weapons on this list. Also a lot of people's favourite, and for good reason. It took me a while to enjoy this weapon, but once I did fully grasp its power, it became clear to me why so many people love it. Its weapon art, the Corpse Piler, is why most people love this weapon so much. It does an insane amount of attacks in such a short period of time, and deals both physical and fire damage, meaning the incantation Flame Grant Me Strength can make this weapon skill do crazy amounts of damage, especially when paired with talismans such as the Rotten Winged Insignia and the Shard of Alexander. And as with all Arcane Bleed weapons, more arcane means more bleed build-up. So even if you only just barely meet the dex requirements for this weapon and then pump every other stat point into arcane, it's still going to do crazy amounts of damage and be very viable. This is one of the latest game weapons on this list. This is dropped by Bloody Finger Okina, who invades you near the Church of Repose, found in the eastern region of the mountaintops of the Giants. At this point, I just want to take a few seconds to specifically thank all of our patrons over on patreon.com. Every single person that goes the extra mile, no, the extra 100 miles to support this channel with a monthly donation is truly appreciated. You really help to keep this channel alive and keep my dream alive of being able to create these videos and help you out and make the likes of Elden Ring and other Soulsborne games easier and more accessible for the world. So to every single patron we have out there, thank you truly so much. Now we'll move on to probably the most stylish weapon on this list. That is Eleonora's Poleblade. As the name suggests, this is the weapon of Bloody Finger Eleonora, and it is obtained by defeating her at the Second Church of Marika in the Altus Plateau. And just in case you were wondering, you don't need to be progressing Yura's questline. When you come to this church, she will invade you regardless of whether or not you have been doing Yura's questline. I'm not a huge fan of any Twin Blade in this game, if I'm honest. I must admit they look awesome, both the actual style of the weapon and of course the moveset. And I appreciate because they do attack so fast, the actual base physical damage needs to be reduced to compensate so they're not overpowered, but I feel like the physical damage is so low that they just don't compare in DPS to many other weapons on this list. The weapon art, however, makes up for that. The Bloodblade Dance deals insane amounts of damage, and with a follow-up attack, you will perform an evasive maneuver and jump backwards, putting you out of range of any enemies following up with a counter-attack. So this is another one, just like the bloody Helice, that if you master the moveset and become one with the weapon, that you can really make your best friend and probably make this build into an absolute killing machine. Next up, we have got my absolute favourite weapon on this list, and that is Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear. I won't spend too much time on this weapon because I have already done a full build based around this weapon, so if you want to know all of the specifics and details, go check that out. You already know my love for it. I cannot overstate how awesome this weapon is. The Blood Boon Ritual Ash of War is a god tier Ash of War. It does stupid amounts of damage over many different attacks and will just obliterate swathes of enemies. I can already feel myself wanting to rant about how you can make the absolute most out of this weapon, but that's not the idea of this video. I need to rein myself in and just go check out the video I've made for this weapon if you are interested in using it to the maximum of its potential. This one is obtained by defeating Mohg, the Lord of Blood, and then trading in his remembrance with Enya at the Round Table Hold. I'll stop swooning over it now and we'll get back to the list. Next up, we've got two more weapons we'll kind of compare in tandem, and that is the Ripple Crescent Halberd and the Ripple Blade. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes explaining exactly why these weapons are so unique and so good. Remember I said at the start that most arcane weapons can't be buffed up with magic or consumables. These two can. Not only that, they have two of the highest arcane scaling attributes in the whole entire game, and that means even though their base damage is very low compared to every other weapon on this list, they are ridiculously good at building up status effects. This is ideal for arcane builds that use a lot of grease and a lot of different status effects. Just to give you one example, with just one swing from a plus 25 Ripple Blade at 60 arcane will deal 220 poison build-up to an enemy. The blade is slightly better at applying status effects, so it's slightly less than that for the Halberd, but the Halberd does have a superior move set and has also got the reach that the blade doesn't have. So for that reason, they're both incredibly amazing for a status build-up heavy build, and I'm sure there are ways to make that build up even more. I haven't used the Ripple weapons in a proper build. I haven't min-maxed with them yet, so I'm sure there's ways to get them numbers even higher. And to put that in perspective, most enemies will be poisoned after around a build-up tick of around 200 to 300 poison, and that includes bosses. So with just one or two swings of these weapons, you can inflict enemies with poison, scarlet rot, frostbite, you name it. Another amazing example to help people out that are struggling with the late game. If you apply a drawstring soporific grease to one of these two weapons, you will be putting bosses to sleep almost instantly, giving you the breathing room you need to run away and heal up or deal with duo bosses much more effectively. It cannot be overstated how powerful these two weapons are when it comes to status effects. And I'm sure there are people that have pushed these two weapons to their limits far more than me and know how to really utilize them to their maximum effectiveness. And finally, for where to get these two weapons, the Ripple Blade is purchased from Pidia the Carian Servant, hidden in the alcove in the Carian Manor, and the Crescent Halberd has a small drop chance from any Albinauric that you see wielding this weapon. There's many of them scattered around the Mohgwyn Palace area, so whenever you're adventuring there, if you want it, just grind for this weapon and you should have it in no time. That is all the melee weapons on this list. Now let's move to the two ranged options we have as an arcane build. First up, let's take a look at the Serpent Bow. This bow is found in a pool of rot in the abandoned cave, which is smack bang in the middle of Caelid, and is also where you find the gold scarab. Despite the fact that this is an arcane weapon, having higher arcane doesn't affect the damage output of this weapon. But what it does affect, and why this is so powerful, is it affects the status build-up of poison, bleed, and sleep on the respective arrows. For that reason, this bow is actually most advantageous with a hybrid build that combines both dexterity and arcane. However, where this really excels is it will add a base 15 poison build up to all arrows, and exactly as the weapon description says, it reveals its true worth when used with poison infused arrows. I am just using the bog standard crafted poison fletched arrows, but ideally what you want to do is purchase serpent arrows for use with this bow. They are sold by the Dragon Barrows Isolated Merchant for 120 runes each, and using the Mighty Shot weapon skill along with the serpent arrows on a fully upgraded serpent bow will inflict most enemies with poison in just one shot. You can see here, even just using jump attacks and regular poison fletched arrows, I'm still inflicting poison on all these enemies in just 2 shots. So it's very, very effective even with these weaker arrows. But if you want to push this to its limit, the serpent arrows are going to be amazing and make this absolutely devastating. Jump shots do actually deal less damage than just standard light attacks, but because the primary reason for using this bow is to inflict the status effects, that's what makes the jump attacks more effective for us. Now let's move on to the final weapon on this list, and that is the Albinauric Staff. This staff is absolutely amazing for people that want to go pure arcane builds, but still would like a fairly powerful ranged option in the form of sorceries. The very low 10 intellect requirement will allow you to use the very FP efficient glintstone pebble without needing to invest into an intellect build, therefore giving you really solid magic damage output for any enemies that are weak against magic but strong against all other damage types. This will make your arcane build so much more versatile, and you shouldn't encounter any enemies in the game at that point that aren't weak to at least one of your forms of damage. I have opted to put just a few more points into intelligence so that I can combine the glintstone pebble with the magic glint blade, because the magic glint blade's damage output is insane, but as you know, it requires a few seconds to formulate the blade and then shoot towards your enemies. So you can queue a few magic glint blades up, and then as they're forming, switch to the glintstone pebble and start spamming them. I have literally got something like 14 intelligence on this character, and as you can see, it's doing upwards of 1,000 damage in just a couple of shots, giving my primarily melee focused arcane build an insane ranged option as well. So yes, you will improve the damage output if you pump loads of points into intelligence as well, but you can see here you don't need to. It's still very, very powerful even with a pure arcane build, meaning you can use this as a really viable mid-game option rather than needing hundreds of points worth of stats. And I should mention the staff is found just here in the Volcano Manor. And just as a quick closing remark from me, using this staff for the purposes of this video was the first time I had used any kind of spells or incantations as part of a full arcane build, and it made me seriously realize the power, and this is definitely a weapon I'll be adding to my arsenal for any future arcane builds. That's how much I feel this staff adds to your damage output and to the overall versatility of a build. And for anyone interested, my top 3 picks from this list and what I advise you focus on would be the Reduvia, so you've got a great early game option, the staff that I just mentioned, which you can pick up fairly early on in Volcano Manor to give you that ranged option, and then late game Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear to really round out your build and make you an absolutely devastating powerhouse not to be trifled with. That is it for all of the best arcane weapons in the game that you should grab to prepare yourself for the Elden Ring DLC. And as always, all that's left for me to say is thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.